Hey, dear members of the Soul Stories family. Today we will bring you a romantic love story, so let's get started. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any meaningful stories. Chapter 1. In the Rain. The rain poured down relentlessly, each heavy drop striking the pavement, blending into the darkness of the late afternoon in the small hillside town. Jacob sat slumped by the roadside, his broad shoulders, once steady in a white lab coat, now trembling beneath a soaked jacket. His hands, the hands that had once wielded a scalpel with the precision of a top surgeon, now hung limp, pale from the cold and motionless, as if they had forgotten their purpose. A few meters away, his old car leaned crookedly on the shoulder, its engine dead, mirroring the man himself at that moment. 3 days earlier, Jacob had stood in a frigid funeral home in the big city, watching two coffins, one large, one small, being lowered into the earth. His wife, Clara, with her gentle smile that had once been the light he woke up to every morning. His daughter, Sophie, just 5 years old, with curly blonde hair and a laugh that rang like wind chimes. A car accident had taken them, a truck veering out of control on the highway while Jacob was at the hospital, performing emergency surgery on a patient whose name he couldn't even recall. He had saved that person, but he couldn't save his family. Clara's final text, "Don't work too late. Sophie wants to hear you tell a story," still sat unanswered in his phone, forever silent. The pain wasn't just a cut, it was a chasm swallowing him from within. The hospital, once a source of pride, now felt like nothing more than sterile white corridors filled with pitying looks from colleagues. "Take some time off, Jacob," they said, but he couldn't. He couldn't stay in the place that had once been home, where every street corner summoned memories of Clara and Sophie. So he drove off with no destination, through unfamiliar roads, until the torrential rain forced him to stop in this small town. He stepped out of the car, carrying no umbrella, nothing but a broken heart and waterlogged shoes. He sank down by the roadside, head bowed to his knees, letting the rain wash away what little remained of his will to live. Not far off, a faint yellow light flickered through the downpour from an old bicycle. Lena pedaled slowly, her light green raincoat clinging to her frame, her hair tied up high, though a few wet strands stuck to her cheeks. She had just closed her small bakery, a long day steeped in the scent of flour and vanilla, and was heading to her wooden house on the hill. This town was where she'd grown up, where she'd learned to live alone after her mother left when she was 8. The memory of that day lingered vividly. Lena standing on the porch, tears streaming down her face, begging her mother to come back, only to watch her figure fade into the mist. Since then, she'd never pleaded for anyone to stay, until today. When her bicycle's light fell on Jacob, Lena stopped short. She didn't know him, a stranger in a tiny town where everyone recognized each other. But something in his slumped posture, in the empty gaze that briefly met the light, gripped her heart. It mirrored her own eyes from that day, standing alone on the porch, waiting for something that would never come. She dismounted, propping her bike against an old oak by the road, and approached him. Rain seeped through her coat, but she didn't care. Jacob didn't look up at first. He heard footsteps, the sound of rain hitting a raincoat, but he lacked the strength to react. Maybe it was just someone passing by, he thought. They'd leave soon enough, like everything else in his life. But then he felt an unexpected warmth. Two small arms wrapped around his shoulders, pulling him into a tight embrace. Startled, he lifted his head and met Lena's brown eyes, glistening with rain but strangely warm. She said nothing for a few seconds, just held him, letting her body's warmth battle the rain's biting cold. "Are you okay?" Lena finally spoke, her voice soft but trembling from the chill. Jacob didn't answer, his lips pressed tight as if speaking would let the fragments inside him spill out. Lena didn't push. She looked at him, and for a fleeting moment, she glimpsed another shape in the rain. A woman or a child, she wasn't sure. She blinked and it vanished, leaving only Jacob before her, alone and shattered. Maybe it was just an illusion, she told herself, but that feeling kept her from walking away. "Go home," she whispered, her voice quiet but firm, more an invitation than a question. Jacob looked at her, his eyes blurred by rain and pain. He didn't know who she was, didn't understand why she was there. But her words, "Go home," pierced the icy shell around his heart like a needle. Home? He hadn't had a home for 3 days, not since Sophie's laughter and Clara's perfume faded forever. Yet Lena's embrace, strange and sudden as it was, stirred something he couldn't name. Not hope, but a faint glimmer in the darkness. Lena stood, pulling him up with her. He didn't resist, though his legs felt like lead. She helped him to his feet, letting him lean on her shoulder, and guided him toward her bicycle. "My house isn't far," she said, her tone gentle but resolute. Jacob didn't object, didn't ask anything. He just followed her, step by slow step through the rain, like a lost soul someone had finally found. As they disappeared from the roadside, the rain kept falling, washing away their footprints on the wet ground. Jacob's car remained behind, silent like a forgotten memory. Meanwhile, a mix of emotions welled up in Lena. Pity, yes, but also a fear that she was stepping into something bigger than herself. Still, she didn't turn back. Not this time. Chapter 2. The Man in the Empty Room. Lena's small house nestled beside her bakery, just a few steps from the town's main road. The rain continued its steady patter on the porch, the sound of drops on the tin roof mingling with the wind rustling through the old oak trees. Lena pushed open the weathered wooden door, leading Jacob inside. The light from a wall-mounted lamp spilled onto the wooden floor, illuminating his tall but weary figure. Water dripped from his soaked jacket, leaving uneven streaks on the floor. But Lena didn't mind. She simply gestured silently toward an old armchair near the fireplace, where flames crackled softly. Jacob sat down without a word. His hands that had once gripped a scalpel with absolute precision, pulling dozens of patients back from the brink of death, now trembled, resting loosely on his lap. He stared at them as if they no longer belonged to him. Those long, nimble fingers, once agile and strong, were now just pale skin stretched over prominent veins. He didn't look up when Lena draped a thick gray wool blanket over his shoulders, nor did he react when she set a steaming mug of tea on the small wooden table beside him. The faint scent of chamomile wafted up, gentle but not enough to pull him from the void within. Lena stood there for a moment, watching him. She didn't know his name, didn't know where he came from, but something in his silence held her gaze. It wasn't just sadness. It was a depth she'd once seen in her own reflection, years ago when her mother left. That day, Lena had stood at the door, clutching her worn cotton dress, watching her mother's figure fade into the distance without understanding why. Her mother hadn't said a word, hadn't looked back, leaving Lena with an empty house and questions that would never find answers. Since then, she'd learned not to ask, not to expect, living quietly with her bakery in days that passed as steadily as her breath. But now, standing before Jacob, she felt a struggle within. She wanted to ask who he was, what had brought him to collapse by the roadside, but she held back. Asking too much might make him retreat further, or worse, stir her own memories of helplessness. She didn't want to remember, didn't want to see her 8-year-old self again, eyes red and desperate. So she did what she could. She grabbed another log from the corner, tossed it into the fireplace, letting the flames grow stronger, spreading warmth into the small room. "Rest," she said, her voice soft but clear, then turned to walk into the kitchen. She didn't wait for a reply. She knew he wouldn't speak. From the kitchen, she heard the faint clink of the teacup against the table, the rustle of the wool blanket as Jacob pulled it tighter around himself. He didn't drink the tea, she guessed, but at least he was here, under her roof, not out there in the freezing rain. While heating water to make tea for herself, Lena glanced through the small kitchen window. The rain still fell, casting a misty veil over the distant hills. She wondered what had compelled her to bring this man here. Compassion? Perhaps. But deeper down, she knew it was his eyes. Eyes of someone who'd lost everything, just like she had back then. She couldn't turn away, not this time. If she did, she'd be no different from her mother, who'd abandoned her without a word. When she returned to the living room, Lena saw Jacob still sitting there, his head tilted back slightly, eyes half closed. She thought he'd fallen asleep, but then he shifted, his hands gripping the edge of the blanket tightly. "I've lost everything," he rasped, his voice hoarse, as if the words had fought their way out of his throat. Lena froze, her hand trembling slightly around her own hot mug. It was the first thing he'd said since she found him in the rain, and it landed heavily like a stone dropping into the room's stillness. She didn't know how to respond. Lost everything. She understood that feeling, but she didn't dare ask more. Instead, she sat in the chair across from him, at a distance that wouldn't feel stifling. You don't have to talk if you don't want to, she said, her tone as gentle as when she soothed the child in her bakery. But you're here now, tonight. Just stay here. Jacob didn't reply, only nodded faintly, his eyes still shut tight, as if opening them would force him to face something unbearable. Lena stood carrying her tea to the small bedroom at the back of the house. She didn't close the door fully, leaving a narrow gap to hear if he needed anything. But as she set her mug on the table, a faint groan came from the living room. She turned back, standing at the doorway, and saw Jacob curled up in the chair, hands clutching his head, breathing heavily. He was dreaming. No, it was a nightmare. She heard him mutter something, the words unclear, but his voice was thick with pain, like someone begging another not to leave. Lena stood still, her hand gripping the doorframe. She wanted to step forward, to wake him, but she stopped herself. She knew those nightmares. She'd had them too, waking in the night with an empty ache when she realized her mother was truly gone. She couldn't do anything for him now except wait, and quietly a thought rose within her. I can't abandon someone again. Not him, not this man, whoever he was. She stood there, silently watching him sink into a restless sleep, the fire in the hearth still crackling, like a small promise that tonight, at least, he wasn't alone. When she returned to her room, the rain outside had eased, reduced to sparse drops on the roof. She lay down, but her eyes stayed open, listening to Jacob's distant breathing. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but in this moment, she'd chosen to stay. Not for him, but for herself. Chapter 3. The Scent of Pastries and Silence. The morning light slipped through the small window of the bakery, illuminating trays of fine white flour on the wooden table. Lena stood there, kneading dough with a steady rhythm, the scent of vanilla and yeast wafting through the air. It had been 3 days since she brought Jacob to the little house beside the bakery. He hadn't left, but he didn't truly stay for any clear reason either. He simply existed, quietly, like a faint shadow in the warm space Lena had created. It wasn't that he wanted to live. She could sense that. Perhaps he just didn't know where to go after leaving the city, the hospital, and everything that had once been his life. Jacob sat on an old stool in the corner of the bakery, his hands resting on his thighs, still trembling slightly, though no longer as cold as that first night. Lena watched him from the corner of her eye, noting that those hands didn't look like they belonged to someone accustomed to hard labor. They were long and slender, with distinct knuckles, surgeon's hands, she guessed, though he'd never said a word about himself. She didn't ask. Instead, she slid a small tray of dough toward him, her voice gentle. Try kneading this. Just follow me. He looked up, his cloudy eyes flickering with faint surprise, but he didn't refuse. He stood, slowly walked to the table, and began kneading the dough with clumsy movements. Lena didn't correct him right away. She let him find his own way, let those hands that had once saved lives now touch something warm and soft, a different kind of life from the cold operating rooms. The dough needs to be kneaded evenly, she said, her voice quiet, more like storytelling than instructing. Otherwise, the bread won't rise. Jacob nodded, saying nothing, but his hands gradually steadied. She looked at him, and in that moment, she felt a tiny spark. Not hope, but a sign that he was still here, even if only in body. She began sharing small stories about the bakery as a way to fill the silence between them. This place belonged to my grandmother, she said, rolling dough into even rounds. She taught me to bake when I was tiny. Once I spilled an entire jar of sugar on the floor. She didn't scold me, just laughed and said, "Be careful next time. But since it's spilled, leave it there. I'll sweep it up later." Lena let out a soft chuckle, a rare smile, and glanced at Jacob to see if he'd react. He didn't smile, but his eyes shifted slightly as if he were listening. She went on. She passed away 5 years ago. I kept the bakery because I didn't know what else to do. She paused, realizing she'd said more than she intended. Opening up wasn't her habit. After her mother left, Lena had learned to keep everything to herself. Sadness, joy, even the little stories. But with Jacob, she wanted to try, just a little. She feared rejection, feared he wouldn't respond, but she kept talking, as if her words were crumbs she scattered to coax him closer. Jacob said nothing, just kept kneading the dough, slow and focused. But when Lena turned to grab a baking tray, she caught his gaze on her, not as empty as before, but with a faint warmth, fragile though it was. She gave a small smile, not pressing him to speak, and they continued working in silence. The sound of dough being kneaded, the crackle of the oven, the scent of pastries spreading. It all wove together like a wordless melody, gently enveloping them. Outside the bakery, the small town began to notice Jacob's presence. When Lena opened the shop early that morning, Mrs. Martha, the flour seller from the street corner, stopped by, pretending to buy bread, but stealing glances at Jacob in the corner. "Who's that?" she asked, her tone curious with a hint of suspicion. Lena smiled lightly. "A friend. He's helping me." Mrs. Martha nodded, but her eyes betrayed her scrutiny. By noon, Jamie, the boy from the grocery store, dashed past, poking his head through the window and shouting, "Lena's got a stranger in the shop. Where's he from?" Lena just waved him off. "Don't yell like that. You'll scare the customers." By afternoon, the rumors had spread. A few townsfolk dropped by the bakery, asking casual questions that clearly fished for more about the strange man. Old Tom, the mechanic, was blunt. "He doesn't look like he's from around here." "Don't let a stranger cause trouble, Lena." Lena only smiled, replying, "He's not trouble, don't worry." But inwardly, she knew they wouldn't let it rest. The town was small, and anything new became fodder for gossip. As the sunset painted the hills gold, Lena closed the shop. Jacob helped her stack the baking trays, his movements less awkward now. She looked at him, and this time asked, "What do you think of baking?" Jacob paused as if the question made him think. "It's, peaceful," he said, his voice rough but clearer than that first night. Lena nodded, not pressing further, but her heart stirred slightly. It was the second thing he'd said to her, and it felt like a door cracking open, just a sliver. They stepped out onto the porch, watching the darkness settle in. Lena held a small, warm loaf of bread and handed it to him. "This is yours," she said. Jacob took it, his hand brushing hers lightly, and in that moment, their eyes met. Wordless, but meaningful. It wasn't closeness, not yet, but a quiet understanding, like two lost souls finding each other in the cool breeze of dusk. When Lena turned back inside, she heard Jacob's footsteps follow, slow but steady. Outside, the town's whispers continued, but within the bakery, there was only the scent of pastries and silence. A silence no longer heavy, but beginning to carry a trace of warmth. Chapter 4. The Past That Won't Rest. Night fell over the small town, so quiet that only the sound of wind rustling through the oak trees outside the porch remained. In the wooden house beside the bakery, the glow from the fireplace had died out, leaving a dim darkness to blanket the small room where Jacob slept. He lay on the armchair, the gray wool blanket pulled up to his chin, but his sleep was far from peaceful. His hands gripped the blanket's edge tightly, his breathing quickened, and then a soft groan escaped his throat. A sound like that of someone trapped in inescapable pain. Jacob jolted awake, eyes wide, sweat rolling down his forehead despite the room's chill. He saw himself in an operating room, blinding white lights, the steady beep of machines, the sharp smell of antiseptic. On the table lay Clara, her eyes closed, her pale face devoid of the gentle smile he'd once loved. Beside her was Sophie, small and fragile, her curly blonde hair matted with blood. He screamed, holding a scalpel but unable to move, as if something held him back. "Don't go!" he cried out in his dream, but no one heard. The heart monitor flatlined, and darkness swallowed him whole. He lurched up from the chair, gasping for air, hands clutching his chest as if to keep his heart from shattering. Lena's small room came into focus, but it wasn't enough to pull him from the nightmare. He trembled, his once steady surgeon's hands now clenched into fists, as if trying to smash the memories clinging to him. Another groan slipped out, quieter but laced with agony, and from the crack in her bedroom door, Lena heard it. She stood there, hand gripping the doorframe, the darkness hiding her face but not the glint of tears in her eyes. She'd been awake already, not because of Jacob's sounds, but because her own restless memories refused to sleep. Watching him curl up in the chair, she saw a piece of herself. An 8-year-old Lena, huddled in a corner of the house, sobbing until her voice gave out after her mother left. On those nights, she too had startled awake, clutching her pillow, waiting for her mother's footsteps to return, only to be answered by the cold whistle of the wind. She shivered now, not from the cold, but from the helplessness rising again, as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. Lena didn't approach Jacob. She stood still, waiting for him to calm, just as she'd once waited for herself to survive those long, lonely nights. She knew no words could soothe him now. She'd once longed for someone to tell her everything would be okay, but no one ever had. Instead, she watched silently, letting him find his own way out of the darkness, if only for a moment. In Jacob's mind, memories flooded back like a film he couldn't pause. He recalled happy days with Clara and Sophie, Sunday mornings when Clara made pancakes in the kitchen, while Sophie darted around his legs, begging him to lift her to the window. "Daddy, look, birds are flying," she chirped, her voice clear as wind chimes. He remembered Clara's smile when he came home late from the hospital. She never complained, just pressed a hot cup of coffee into his hands. "Don't work too late, okay?" Those moments had been everything to him, the reason he woke each day. Then came the fateful day. He was mid-surgery, scalpel in hand, eyes fixed on the patient, when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't answer. Operating room rules forbade it. When the surgery ended, he stepped out to find dozens of missed calls from an unknown number. A stranger's voice answered his callback. "Doctor, Jacob, your wife and daughter, an accident. We did all we could." He couldn't recall collapsing on the hospital floor, only the echo of his own scream reverberating through the sterile white halls. From the doorway, Lena saw Jacob clutch his head, his shoulders shaking violently. She stepped closer, but kept her distance, not touching him. She remembered the last time she saw her mother, standing at the threshold, suitcase in hand, eyes distant. "Where are you going, Mom?" Lena had asked, voice choked. Her mother didn't answer, just walked out without looking back. Lena ran after her, grabbing her hand, but her mother pulled away, cold and resolute. The door shut, and Lena stood there alone until darkness swallowed her mother's figure. Looking at Jacob, Lena realized something. His pain mirrored hers from that day. The powerlessness of losing someone loved, the feeling of being left behind without explanation. But there was a difference. She'd chosen to stay with him, though she didn't know why. Maybe because she didn't want him to suffer alone as she had. Maybe helping him was also a way to heal herself, a wound she'd buried for years. Jacob gradually settled, his breathing slowing, though still labored. He leaned back, eyes shut tight, as if hiding from reality. Lena returned to her room but left the door ajar. She sat on the bed, hugging her knees, letting tears roll silently down her cheeks. She didn't sob. She hadn't since the day her mother left. But this time, the tears weren't just for her. They were for Jacob, for the pain they both carried. Outside, the wind stilled, leaving a hush over the house. Jacob sank into a restless sleep, while Lena lay down, eyes open, listening to his distant breathing. Their pasts wouldn't rest, but tonight they weren't alone in the dark, and in that silence an invisible thread began to form. Fragile, but enough to hold them together. Chapter 5. A clear day. The sun rose above the hills, casting a soft golden light over the small town. The rain was gone, and the sky stretched clear and blue, as if freshly washed, bringing a cool breeze through the open window of Lena's bakery. Inside, the scent of flour and melting butter mingled in the air, creating a warm space that both Jacob and Lena had grown accustomed to. Today marked the 7th day since Jacob had entered her life, and though he remained as quiet as a shadow, something in him was shifting. subtle, but enough for Lena to notice. Lena stood at the wooden table, rolling dough into small rounds for the morning's bread. She glanced up at Jacob, who stood across from her, holding another tray of dough. He no longer sat idly in the corner as he had in the early days. Yesterday, she'd convinced him to try baking with her, and though his efforts were clumsy, she hadn't corrected him, only smiled. Just do it. Nobody's good right away. Now he stood there, his hands once adept with a scalpel, carefully sprinkling sugar over the dough, his movements slow but no longer trembling. Easy with that, or the sugar'll spill everywhere, Lena teased lightly. Jacob looked up, momentarily surprised, but he adjusted his touch. As she bent to check the oven, a bit of flour from her hand smudged onto her nose. She didn't notice continuing to roll dough until she heard an unfamiliar sound. A low, raspy chuckle, genuine, coming from Jacob. She looked up, startled, and saw him watching her, the corner of his mouth lifting in a rare smile. "What's so funny?" she asked, feigning sternness, though her eyes sparkled. "Flour? On your nose," Jacob said, his voice rough but clearer than in days past. He pointed to his own face, mimicking the spot. Lena touched her nose, feeling the fine powder on her fingers, and then she laughed. A bright, natural sound she rarely shared with anyone. She wiped it with her sleeve, only smearing it more, prompting Jacob to laugh again, louder this time, though still brief. Lena was struck by her own reaction. She couldn't recall the last time she'd laughed so freely. Maybe it was back when her grandmother was alive, when they'd bake together and swap silly stories. With Jacob, it came unexpectedly, like a small ray of sunlight breaking through thick clouds. They resumed their work without another word, but the air between them felt lighter. That laugh, brief as it was, had cracked an invisible wall. Lena glanced at him, noticing his eyes weren't entirely vacant anymore. There was a faint glimmer, fragile like the tiny flame in the fireplace from his first days here. She didn't push him to speak, didn't ask anything, just quietly savored the moment. The first time she felt he was truly present, not just a shadow. Outside the bakery, the town was growing used to Jacob. Mrs. Martha, the flour seller, stopped by for a loaf and smiled at him. "You're not bad at this baking thing, are you?" Jamie, the boy from the grocery store, no longer shouted through the window. He darted inside, asking curiously, "Do you make chocolate bread?" Jacob shook his head, but answered this time, "Not yet, but I could try." Jamie cheered, running off to tell his friends, and Lena smiled as she watched. Slowly, the townsfolk stopped calling him the strange man. He became part of their daily chatter, though some wariness lingered. Not everyone warmed to him so easily. As Lena carried a tray to the counter, Mr. Henry, the gruff neighbor a few houses down, hobbled in, leaning on his cane, eyeing Jacob up and down. "What's he doing here, Lena?" he asked brusquely. "Doesn't look like a baker. City folk, huh?" Lena set the tray down, offering a gentle smile to diffuse him. "He's helping me, Mr. Henry. What's wrong with that?" He huffed. "I don't like strangers." "Watch yourself. Don't let your grandma's shop get a bad name." He turned and left, leaving a heavy silence. Lena glanced at Jacob, worried he'd retreat inward, but he just shrugged and kept arranging the bread, as if he hadn't heard. By afternoon, when the shop closed, Lena invited Jacob outside. "Come with me for a bit," she said, grabbing a small basket with a few leftover loaves. He nodded and followed her along a path winding to a lake tucked behind the hills. The lake was small, its clear water mirroring the sky, framed by tall pines. "I come here a lot," Lena said, sitting on the grassy bank and breaking off a piece of bread to hand him. "When I was a kid, whenever I felt down, I'd sit here all day, watching the water, listening to the wind. It helped me forget a little." Jacob took the bread, gazing at the lake in silence. "It's peaceful," he said, his voice low but less strained than before. Lena nodded, looking at him. "Did you ever have a place like this?" He paused, then answered, "Yeah. A park near home. I used to take my daughter there." He stopped, his eyes clouding briefly, but he didn't curl in on himself like he had during his nightmares. Lena didn't press, just sat beside him, letting the wind speak for them. As the sun set, they stood to head back. Jacob walked slowly, holding the leftover bread, and for the first time he spoke unprompted. "Thanks. For this place." Lena turned, surprised, but smiled. "Next time, we'll come again." They walked side by side, their shadows stretching long on the path, and a warmth spread through Lena, not just from the clear day, but from knowing that, even just a little, Jacob was stepping out of the darkness. Chapter 6. How long have you been here? Night draped over the small town, the faint moonlight filtering through the oak branches, casting a soft glow on the wooden porch of Lena's house. Inside the bakery, the scent of vanilla lingered after a long day's work. Lena sat in the armchair, holding a cooled cup of chamomile tea, her gaze drifting toward the window. Jacob sat across from her on the old stool, hands clasped together, his eyes lost in the void. The space between them was quiet, but no longer as heavy as it once was. It felt like the silence of people who had grown familiar, even if they didn't fully understand each other yet. Today the bakery had been busier than usual. A group of children from the nearby school had stopped by, laughing and begging Lena for extra sweets. Jacob had helped her wrap the pastries, his hands no longer as clumsy as before. And when one boy asked, "Can you tell good stories?" he'd given a faint smile and said, "I used to." Lena overheard but didn't press, only watched quietly. She sensed a door in him beginning to crack open, however slowly. Now with the shop closed, Lena set her tea down and looked at Jacob. "Pretty lively today, huh?" she said, her voice gentle, like the start of a casual chat. Jacob nodded, the corner of his mouth twitching slightly, but he didn't reply. She was about to turn away, leaving him to his silence when he spoke unexpectedly, his voice low and rough. "My daughter, she loved bedtime stories." Lena froze, eyes widening, caught off guard by him broaching that subject. She sat up straighter, listening intently, not daring to interrupt. Jacob bowed his head, his hands tightening as if those memories were a sharp blade he had to grip. "Sophie," he said, naming his daughter for the first time in front of Lena. "She was 5. Every night she'd beg me for a story about princesses, knights, or just the birds in the park. I wasn't good at it, but she didn't care." His voice caught, each word dragged from a deep place within. "Once I came home late, and she waited up until she fell asleep, still Bao Jiao, a picture book." He stopped, eyes squeezing shut, his breathing shaky. Lena sat still, her hands clutching the armrest. She didn't know what to say. No words could ease that kind of pain, but she heard in every syllable he spoke a profound love and an irreparable loss. She pictured Sophie, a little girl with blonde hair, bright eyes, a laugh like wind chimes, and her heart clenched. She wanted to ask more, to learn about Clara, about the family he'd once had, but she held back. This was the first time he'd opened up, and she didn't want to shatter it. Yet within Lena, a quiet fear stirred. What if she grew attached to him, let him into her life, and then he left too? Like her mother had, like others who'd come and gone in her life. She looked at Jacob, lost in his memories, and wondered, would he stay, or was he just a traveler pausing here? That fear made her hands tremble slightly, but she hid it, not wanting him to see. She took a deep breath, steadying her voice, and asked, "Do you ever feel like you're still waiting for someone?" The question slipped out naturally, a whisper she hadn't meant to voice aloud. Jacob looked up, his eyes meeting hers, deep and full of broken pieces. He was silent for a moment, then answered, his voice hoarse but clear. "I've been waiting for someone to say, 'Welcome home.' Since I lost them, I've always waited for that." His words pierced Lena's heart like a needle. She knew that feeling. She'd waited for her mother to return, for someone to say she wasn't abandoned. But no one ever did, not until she built her own home in this bakery. Looking at Jacob, she saw herself, a lost soul yearning for a place to belong. And in that moment, she decided to say what she'd held back since the night they met. "Then I'm saying it," she whispered, her voice trembling, not from cold but from fear. Fear that her words wouldn't be enough to hold him, fear that he wouldn't hear their true meaning. Jacob stared at her, eyes widening as if he couldn't believe what he'd heard. "Welcome home," she repeated, louder this time, though her voice still wavered. She wasn't sure what home she meant, this wooden house, the bakery, or just her presence beside him, but she wanted him to know that at least he wasn't alone anymore. Jacob didn't respond right away. He lowered his head, hands covering his face, and for a fleeting second, Lena feared she'd misstepped, that he'd close off again. But then he looked up, his eyes misty though he held the tears back. "Thank you," he said, his voice choked but sincere. It was all he could manage, and Lena understood. She didn't need more. They sat there in a new kind of silence. No longer a divide, but a quiet understanding. The moonlight outside grew brighter, streaming through the window, illuminating Jacob's face. Not empty anymore, but softened by a gentler sadness. Lena stood carrying her tea to the kitchen, but before leaving she turned back to him. "Good night," she said softly. Jacob nodded, and for the first time he smiled. A small, fragile smile, but enough to warm Lena's heart. As she lay in bed, eyes closed, she heard Jacob's steady breathing from the other room. The fear of him leaving lingered, but it was smaller now, overshadowed by a new feeling. A spark of hope that perhaps they were both finding what they'd long waited for. Are you still following the story? What do you think happiness is? For me, happiness is living joyfully with the people I love, feeling peace in my soul, knowing I'm living true to myself, and bringing something good to those around me. What about you? Please comment so I can know. Chapter 7. The Small, Beautiful Things. The early autumn sunlight stretched gently along the path leading into the town, tinting the oak leaves with gold as they began to change color. A light breeze carried the fresh breath of the new season. Inside Lena's bakery, the scent of melting butter and flour filled the air, a fragrance that had become routine over the nearly 2 months since Jacob entered her life. 2 months wasn't long for most, but for Jacob it was a slow journey through shards of a broken past, and for Lena it was days spent quietly watching a shattered man begin to reclaim a flicker of light. Jacob hadn't left after that first night, nor after the first week. He stayed, not because he wanted to live, but because the overwhelming pain of losing Claire and Sophie had drained his will to move on. 2 months ago, he'd been a ghost, trembling hands, vacant eyes, and nights tormented by nightmares. Lena had been patient, never pushing him to speak, never probing his past, simply letting him stay, like a lost traveler granted shelter. Now he stood by the wooden table, arranging freshly baked loaves on a tray, his movements slow but steadier, though sorrow still clung to him like an unshakable shadow. Today, as sunlight streamed through the window, brightening the bakery's corner, Lena shared a story. "When I first started on my own, I once fell asleep in the shop all night. No one woke me, so I just lay there, surrounded by flour until morning when customers knocked." She chuckled softly, her hands slowing as she rolled dough, her gaze distant. Jacob looked up, listening, and after a brief silence, he replied, "The first time I was a dad, I was so clumsy. Sophie cried all night, and I didn't know what to do. Just paced the room holding her. Clara had to teach me how to soothe her." His voice was low, catching slightly, but he didn't stop as he once would have. "I used to be proud of my surgeries," he continued, eyes dropping to his hands. "Once, a 10-hour heart operation. Patient woke up, grabbed my hand to thank me. Back then, I thought I could do anything." He gave a faint, sad smile, as if that pride were now just a distant memory. Lena paused her rolling, looking at him. Over these 2 months, she'd seen him change. Not quickly, not obviously, but enough to notice. From a man who sat silently in the corner, he now helped her bake and fix small things around the shop. Last week, he'd repaired the wooden fence out back after she complained it wobbled in strong winds. "I'll do it," he'd said simply, grabbing a hammer and nails and working all afternoon. When he finished, he brushed off his hands, looked at the sturdy fence and said, "It won't fall now." Lena brought him a glass of water, set it beside him and smiled. "Thanks." They'd also rearranged the bakery. Jacob moved heavy wooden shelves she couldn't reach, wiped down dusty corners neglected for years. "Looks neater now," he said when they were done, and Lena nodded, feeling the shop was no longer just hers. These small acts, the stories he shared, were like pieces filling the gap between them. The space wasn't just silence anymore. It was a quiet closeness built from small, beautiful things. The town noticed too. 2 months had been enough for people to grow accustomed to Jacob behind the counter, wrapping bread or pouring water for customers. Mrs. Martha whispered to Lena, "You two look good together." Jamie dashed in, grinning. "Are you and Jacob a couple?" Lena blushed, waving him off. "Don't talk nonsense," but her heart warmed. Slowly, they stopped calling him the stranger. He became part of the town's daily rhythm, though his pain remained a mystery they didn't touch. But Lena knew, and she hid a deep fear, that these 2 months were temporary, that he might leave like her mother had, leaving her with an unfillable void. That afternoon, as Lena wiped the counter, a man walked in. Tall, wearing a gray coat, his sharp eyes scanned the room before landing on Jacob. "Jacob," he called, voice tinged with surprise. Jacob looked up, his hand pausing mid-tray, his gaze flickering. "Mark," he replied, voice low. Lena stood still, unease rising. Mark was an old colleague from the city hospital. "You've been gone 2 months. No one knew where you were," he said, stepping closer. "I stopped by here by chance. Never thought I'd find you in a bakery." He laughed, but his eyes were curious. Jacob shrugged. "I'm just here." Mark nodded, then casually added, "The hospital still needs you. Some patients ask about you. They miss Doctor." "Jacob, you're not coming back?" Those words cut like a knife, reopening the pain Jacob had tried to bury these past 2 months. He went silent, hands gripping the table's edge, eyes staring into the distance. 2 months here, he'd started finding peace in small things. The smell of bread, Lena's laughter, the fence he fixed, but Mark's words yanked him back. He'd been a doctor, had another life, and the loss of Clara and Sophie still lingered, deep and indelible. He wavered, unsure where he belonged. Lena overheard, her hand trembling as she wiped the counter. If he returned to the city, if he left after these 2 months, what would she do? The fear of losing him surged, stronger than ever, but she hid it, turning away so he wouldn't see. Mark clapped Jacob's shoulder. "Think about it. You shouldn't waste your talent here." Then he left, leaving a heavy air in the shop. That night, they sat on the porch, the moon hanging over the hills. Lena didn't ask about Mark, but her eyes betrayed her worry. Jacob spoke first. 2 months ago, I didn't know what I wanted. I just wanted to escape." He turned to her, voice low. "But here I've found small things, beautiful things, like fixing the fence, baking, or sitting like this with you." His eyes softened, though a trace of uncertainty lingered. Lena smiled, though her heart felt heavy. "That's enough," she said, but she knew it wasn't. Not enough to erase the fear that he might leave, taking with him the small things now marked by his presence. Chapter 8. A Different Rain. The late autumn afternoon in the small town turned somber as thick, dark clouds rolled in, blotting out the gentle sunlight of the previous day. A strong wind whipped through, sending dry leaves skittering along the path to the bakery. Lena stood by the window, a cloth in hand, peering out with a hint of worry. "A big rain's coming," she said softly, just loud enough for Jacob to hear from the corner of the shop, where he was stacking trays of bread. He nodded, but a flicker of tension crossed his eyes. Something Lena didn't catch right away, though she'd soon understand. Minutes later, the rain unleashed, fierce and unrelenting, pounding the tin roof with a deafening roar that drowned out every sound in the bakery. The wind howled through the cracks, flinging the front door wide open. "I'll close it!" Lena shouted over the noise, rushing to the porch, but Jacob was faster. He darted outside, wrestling the heavy wooden door shut, his thin shirt instantly soaked through. When he turned back, Lena saw him trembling, not just from the cold, but from something deeper. 2 months ago, Jacob had received the news of his wife and daughter's deaths on a day of torrential rain and fierce winds like this. He'd been in surgery at the hospital, scalpel in hand, eyes fixed on the patient, when his phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket. He didn't answer. Operating room rules forbade it. When the surgery ended, he stepped into the hallway, rain hammering the glass doors, wind shrieking like a wail. A colleague rushed up, face ashen. Jacob, Clara, and Sophie. An accident. They didn't make it. He stood frozen, the sound of rain blending with the shattering of his heart. Since then, every heavy rain wasn't just water. It was the sound of that fateful day, the wind that stole his family, the helplessness he couldn't erase. Now standing on the porch, Jacob shook, eyes wide, staring into the downpour. The rains drumming on the roof echoed the imagined sound of breaking glass in his mind. The wind's howl like the truck's siren he'd never heard but always haunted him. No, no, he muttered, hands clutching his head as if to block the memories surging back. Lena stepped forward, calling, "Jacob?" But he didn't hear. He saw that day again. The hospital hallway, the rain, the stranger's voice on the phone announcing Clara and Sophie's deaths. He hadn't been there to save them, and rain had become a cruel reminder of his powerlessness. "Jacob!" Lena shouted louder, grabbing his hand. He flinched, turning to her, eyes wild, breath ragged. "I hear the rain. That day," he whispered, voice trembling, his grip tightening on her hand like it was an anchor. Lena didn't let go. She pulled him inside, rain still splashing through the porch, soaking them both. She didn't care. "I'm here," she whispered, soft but firm, repeating it like a vow. He shook harder, head dropping, and she drew him into an embrace, tight, warm, like the first hug she'd given him in the rain 2 months ago. They stood there on the porch, rain pelting them, but Lena didn't pull away. She felt his pain in every shudder of his body, in the choked breaths he tried to stifle. And then Jacob broke, small, halting sobs escaping, like a dam bursting after 2 months of holding back. His tears mingled with the rain, streaking down his face. And this time, it wasn't just the pain of losing Clara and Sophie. It was release. He cried because he wasn't alone anymore. Because Lena was here, holding his hand, hugging him, not abandoning him as he'd once thought he'd forever be left in that rain. Lena cried too. Silent tears rolled down her cheeks, soaking into Jacob's wet shoulder, but she didn't wipe them away. She realized in this embrace, she wasn't just comforting him, she was overcoming herself. For 2 months, she lived with the fear he'd leave, that she'd be abandoned again, like the day her mother walked out the door without looking back. But now, standing in the rain, she wasn't afraid anymore. She chose to stay, to hold his hand, even if it meant facing the possibility of losing him later. Her tears were a liberation, not from sadness, but from finding the strength to trust, to connect, if only for this moment. They held each other for a long time, rain still falling, but the roaring sound no longer felt menacing. Jacob calmed, his breathing slowing, though still heavy. He looked up, eyes red, meeting Lena's gaze. "Thank you," he whispered, voice hoarse but heartfelt. Lena smiled through her tears, her hand still clasping his. "Don't be afraid," she said, unsure if she was reassuring him or herself. "No matter what, I'm here." The rain began to ease, sparse drops pattering onto the porch, leaving small, shimmering puddles under the bakery's light. Jacob and Lena stepped inside, drenched but no longer shaking. She grabbed a wool blanket from the armchair, wrapping it around his shoulders, then sat beside him near the rekindled fireplace. The flames crackled, spreading warmth into the room, chasing away the chill of the rain. They said nothing more, just sat there, hands still intertwined, as if letting go would mean losing what they'd just found. Outside, the rain stopped completely, leaving a stillness over the town. The moon peeked through the dissipating clouds, its light streaming through the window, illuminating Jacob and Lena's faces. He looked at her, his eyes no longer panicked but holding a fragile peace. She looked back, and in that gaze she saw an unspoken promise, that no matter how painful the past, they'd found each other in this different rain. Chapter 9. If I leave? The morning light faded as gray clouds gathered, casting a gentle gloom over the small town. Inside the bakery, the scent of freshly baked bread still lingered, but the atmosphere today lacked the ease of previous days. Jacob stood by the wooden table, holding a tray of bread, but his eyes drifted elsewhere, unfocused. Lena wiped the counter, her movements slow, though her gaze flicked toward him now and then, filled with worry. Over the past 2 months, they'd built a fragile yet precious bond, and now it faced a test neither had anticipated. That morning, a letter arrived at the bakery, not from a townsfolk, but from the city. Jacob opened it in front of Lena, his hand trembling slightly as he read the words from the chief surgeon at his old hospital. "We need you back, Jacob," it said. "The hospital is short on skilled doctors, and you're someone we trust. This is your chance to return to work." The letter wasn't just an invitation. It was a push, echoing the tone of Mark, his former colleague who'd visited last week. "You can't hide here forever." Jacob set the letter down without a word, but Lena saw his eyes waver, a struggle between the past he'd left behind and the present he was living. All day, Jacob was quieter than usual. He still baked, still helped Lena stack trays, but each movement carried an invisible weight. Lena didn't ask, didn't want to press him, but inside her fear grew. For 2 months, she'd grown used to his presence, his footsteps in the shop, his hands fixing the fence, his voice recounting Sophie or his surgeries. If he returned to the city, if he left, what would become of her? She tried to hide it, continuing to wipe the counter, but her hand trembled, and each glance at him brought back the image of her mother, walking out the door without looking back. By afternoon, when the shop closed, Jacob stepped onto the porch, sitting on the steps, his eyes fixed on the path leading out of town. Lena stood at the door, clutching a cloth, watching silently. She knew what he was thinking. The letter wasn't just an offer, it was a door reopening to his old life, where he'd been a skilled doctor, had a family, had everything. But here, he had her, the bakery, the small things that had helped him find a sliver of peace after 2 months of fleeing his pain. He hesitated, and that hesitation tightened Lena's chest. Finally, she stepped out and sat beside him. The wind blew, carrying the chill of dusk, but she said nothing, just waited. Jacob turned to her, his eyes deep with unspoken questions. "If I leave," he began, his voice low and halting, "would you be sad?" His question pierced her heart like a blade, but it was also the first time he'd asked about her feelings, about what she'd think if he were gone. Lena stayed silent for a moment, her hands tightening around the cloth. She looked out at the path, where the light was fading, and memories flooded back. The day her mother left, no goodbye, no glance back. She remembered standing at the door, crying until her voice broke, begging her to stay, but her mother didn't hear. Since then, she'd never dared believe anyone would stay with her forever. But with Jacob, she'd started to believe, just a little, and now the thought of him leaving made her feel suffocated. "I've seen someone leave and never come back," she said, her voice soft but clear, revealing her heart fully for the first time. "The day my mom left, I stood at the door, calling for her, but she didn't listen. I lost her, and with her, the feeling that I could keep anyone from going. This time," she paused, her eyes misting, but she didn't look away. "This time, I don't want to lose anyone else." Her words trembled, not from weakness, but from the courage it took to say them, to let him know how much he meant to her. Jacob stared at her, eyes widening as if he hadn't expected those words. He bowed his head, hands covering his face, and for a moment, Lena feared he'd stay silent, retreat as he had before. But then he looked up, voice hoarse. "I don't want you to be sad. I don't know if I can stay, but I don't want you to wait for someone like I've waited." He paused, meeting her gaze with sincerity and pain. "These past 2 months, you've given me a place to breathe again. I don't know if I deserve it." Lena smiled through her tears, her hand brushing his lightly. "You don't need to deserve it," she said. "You just need to be here, with me, if you want to." Her words weren't a plea, they were an invitation, a door she opened, though she knew he might not step through. They sat there under the gray sky, the wind tousling Lena's hair. Jacob didn't answer right away, but he took her hand, not tightly, just enough for her to feel his warmth. "I'll think about it," he said, his voice low but steadier. Lena nodded, not pushing him, but inside the fear lingered, not as overwhelming as before, but enough to make her wonder if 2 months were enough to hold him here. As they stood to go inside, the bakery's light spilled out, illuminating their figures. Jacob turned to her, asking, "What do you want to bake tomorrow?" It was a simple question, but it felt like a small promise that at least tomorrow he'd still be here. Lena smiled. "Cinnamon bread. Do you like it?" He nodded and they stepped inside, leaving the path behind, a path leading out of town, one Jacob hadn't yet chosen. Chapter 10. A New Spring. Spring draped the small hillside town in a fresh coat, warm breezes carrying the scent of new grass and wildflowers blooming along the winding path. Soft golden sunlight filtered through the oak branches, illuminating the wooden roof of Lena's bakery, a place that had become more than just a familiar haven of sweet aromas. It was now the heart of a quiet but profound change. 6 months had passed since that cold autumn rain when Lena found Jacob, a broken man slumped by the roadside, carrying an unspoken grief. Now, as the first flowers blossomed on the hills, Jacob faced a momentous choice: to stay or to leave. After Mark's visit and the letter from the hospital, Jacob had spent many nights on the porch, staring at the path leading out of town. The letter sat silently on the bakery's wooden table, an invitation to return to the city, to reclaim his life as a doctor, but also a reminder of that stormy day when he learned Clara and Sophie were gone. He wrestled not with the pain, which had softened somewhat, but with the question, where did he belong? The city with its surgeries and cold white lights, or here, where he'd found a sliver of peace with Lena and the small things she offered. In the end, he chose to stay, not out of a promise, but because he wanted to live, not just for himself, but for those who needed him. On a clear spring day, Jacob told Lena, "I want to open a clinic here." She paused mid-roll, looking up, her eyes brightening. "A clinic?" He nodded, his voice low but firm. "Not big, just to help those who can't afford care, kids, the poor." Lena smiled, a gentle smile she always reserved for him. "I'll help you." From then on they began, not in haste, but with a quiet unity. The small clinic took shape in an abandoned wooden house near the bakery, just steps away. Jacob worked through the spring days, fixing the leaky roof, painting the walls a warm white, and bringing in basic medical supplies from the savings he had left after leaving the city. The townsfolk pitched in. Old Tom brought a sturdy old table. Mrs. Martha placed purple flower pots by the door, and Jamie and his friends ran back and forth, hauling small items with ringing laughter. Lena turned the bakery into a warm stopover. She set a small table on the porch with a pot of hot tea and free loaves of bread. "They need something before seeing you," she told Jacob, and he nodded, his eyes reflecting a wordless gratitude. The clinic opened on a mild spring day. No ceremony, just a handful of poor townsfolk and orphaned kids standing at the door, clutching worn bundles of clothes. Jacob wore a white coat for the first time in 6 months, his once trembling hands now steady as he held a stethoscope. He treated them for free, skinny kids with no money for cold medicine, elderly folks with aching joints who'd never dreamed of a city hospital. "Thank you, doctor," an old woman said, gripping his hand with her frail strength, and Jacob smiled, a light, genuine smile. He didn't say it, but each time he helped someone, he felt he was redeeming something. Not the pain of losing Clara and Sophie, but the helplessness that had haunted him through those rainy autumn days. Lena watched from the bakery door, holding a tray of fresh bread, peering through the window. She didn't intrude, only brought tea and bread when he took a break. Over 6 months they'd been together, not as a couple but as companions, sharing wordless sorrows. Jacob spoke of Sophie and Clara on long nights, Lena of her mother on quiet afternoons, not seeking love, but understanding, walking through old wounds together. One day when the clinic was empty, Jacob took a brush and paint, sketching on the waiting room wall. 2 hands clasped amid rain. He didn't explain, but Lena understood. It was the day they met, when she hugged him in the autumn rain and said, "Go home." The painting marked their journey, from 2 lost souls to a place where they found solace in each other. The town began to change with the clinic. Orphaned kids gathered in the waiting room, laughing as Jacob checked their health, tiny hands waving the bread Lena gave them. The poor no longer had to travel far for care. They had Jacob, and beside him Lena, always ready with a hot cup of tea and a gentle smile. Mrs. Martha told Lena, "You two make a good team." Lena laughed. "We just help each other." Their bond wasn't love, not yet, but a deep empathy, forged through rainy days, silent nights, and the small things they did together. The following spring, as light rain pattered on the porch roof, Jacob and Lena stood in the clinic, watching kids play outside. The rain no longer made Jacob tremble. It was now a sound of life, not a painful memory. He turned to Lena, eyes soft, and pulled her into a hug. She rested her head on his shoulder, feeling his warmth. "Thank you for saying, 'Go home,'" he whispered, his voice rough but full of emotion. Lena smiled. "Thank you for staying." They said nothing more, standing there, the rain a backdrop to the moment. 2 years later, when spring returned, Jacob and Lena became a couple. Not rushed, not loud, but as natural as their companionship had been. No confessions were needed. Their understanding spoke for them. The clinic had become indispensable to the town, and the bakery remained a warm haven. On a rainy spring day, they stood under the clinic's porch, hand in hand, listening to the kids' laughter from the waiting room. A boy ran out, holding a loaf, shouting, "Dr. Jacob, I'll tell you a story tomorrow, okay?" Jacob laughed. "Sure, but it better be happy." Lena watched, her heart warm. The story closed in that moment. Not a perfect ending, but a long journey of healing. Jacob and Lena stood under the porch, rain falling lightly, yet neither was wet, neither lost. The rain was a sound of life, of the days they'd overcome, the people they'd helped, and the home they'd built together. The painting on the wall bore quiet witness, two hands clasped in the rain, a promise that they'd found each other, not just in empathy, but now in love. Sometimes happiness lies in having a place to return to and someone waiting there with open arms. Thank you for following this heartfelt story of Soul Stories channel. Share your thoughts about the story in the comments below. If you believe that true love can withstand all trials and sometimes begins in the simplest of ways, don't forget to hit the like button and share this story with your friends. To never miss out on touching and meaningful stories, subscribe to our channel and help us spread messages of love and warmth to everyone. Let's cherish